Hey y'all. My name is Kelly and welcome to my channel, Cleansed by the Blood. I am excited to be getting started with this Bible breakdown, Bible study series was the goal of the channel, was to dig into the Word of God, to really ask questions that provoke thought and to try to understand the different things that God could be trying to say to us through his word. It is a living word. So sometimes what one thing might mean to you may not mean the same thing to me, or the meaning can change depending on the circumstances that God is speaking through. So either way, I'm excited to be getting started. Today I will be starting in the book of Matthew. I love Matthew. It was the first book that I read all the way through when I got saved. And I like Matthew because it's the longest gospel. It has the most details. And it really gives a good picture of who Jesus was as a person, what his ministry was about. And it really dispelled a lot of the things that I knew about him when I was in the world, just the things that I heard. I found out that either it wasn't true or it just wasn't a full depiction of who he was. So we will be starting in chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Matthew. And this was probably the most fun for me to study and break down so far because it goes over Jesus' lineage, which is usually a part that a lot of people skip, but not a lot of people want to really dig into it. And it can seem boring at first when we see books that go over the lineages, especially like in the Old Testament when they're going on and on and on about who was who and who was who, whose kid, and how the whole lineup goes. But Jesus' lineage was it was very eye-opening for me because his lineage, well, Matthew for one, was somebody that he was the only one who listed women in the lineage of Jesus. That wasn't the norm back then. They usually just listed the men that carried on the family line, but he mentioned the women, and almost every single woman that he mentioned was a Gentile woman. And so Matthew was really setting the stage here to let us know that God always had a heart for everybody. Yes, Israelite was what he called his first fruit. It was set aside as an example to the whole world of who he was as God and what he could do in a nation of people. But God always had a heart for the whole world, for all people. Matthew really exemplified that here. He also wanted to set the stage as Jesus being the king of all kings, because he started his lineage from he started his lineage from Abraham, but he really emphasized that he was the son of Abraham, son of David, and David was royalty. He was the second king of Israel, but he was like the first real king that I wanted to put in place. Saul was like punishment for even asking for a king. So anyway, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Just to let you guys know, I am using my interlinear Bible here, and I like this Bible because it's a word by word translation from the original language of the Bible, whichever section we're in. Old Testament is Hebrew, New Testament is Greek. And so sometimes the words are not the exact same words. Even with the King James Version, it would be different in this version because sometimes the words are more direct. Some of the translations can include more of what they feel they were trying to say, and this is more of a direct, this is what this word says, this is what this word means. So and a lot of the words can be translated into English in many different ways, so we'll keep that in mind too. But I'm gonna go ahead and open up here to Matthew. Matthew was a tax collector. The disciples, I can't really say if Paul, I'm not really sure if Paul was a Jew, or if he was a Gentile, but I think that he was a Jew who was born in Rome, and then he came back to Jerusalem when he decided to become a Pharisee, or to start studying school. Either way, all of the disciples were of the Jewish lineage. So Matthew was a Jewish man, but he was considered kind of like on the outskirts of society. He was considered an outcast because he was a tax collector, which means that he directly worked with the nation that was oppressing them to and enforced their high exuberant fees that was keeping a lot of people in debt and poverty, and was causing the Jewish people to suffer. And they looked at that as a form of betrayal. So you'll see, even in the book of Matthew, they'll talk about, a lot of times when they talk about people who are scorned in society, prostitutes, they always mention the tax collectors. They hated them. And so here goes Matthew. He got called into ministry, and we'll go over that as well in the book of Matthew, how he got called. But when he got called by Jesus, he completely gave up his job as a tax collector. But because tax collectors are very they have to be very analytical, they have to deal with numbers, they were dealing with a lot of money and accounts. And so that is shown here in Matthew's book, because he's very detailed. He's very detail oriented. He kind of sometimes brings out the combination of numbers and things like that. And so you could tell that that his occupation, and probably his personality that led him into the occupation, really shows in the way that he wrote his book. All right, so we start here. The book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So like I said, this is where he's establishing the kingship and the right that Jesus had to rule over the Jewish people. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. So Jacob is the one who had the 12 sons. I'm sure even if you haven't read much of the Bible, that you've heard the story of Joseph with the coat of many colors. And so he had 12 sons. Judah was the fourth son of his first wife. And so it goes on to say, and Judah fathered Perez and Zerah out of Tamar. And so here's the first woman that is being mentioned. Tamar, it was interesting because Tamar was a Gentile, and the conception of the twins that she birthed to him was actually kind of scandalous. Judah had 3 sons, and Tamar was originally pledged to wed, and did wed his first son, Er. But Er was someone that God considered evil, and so he died shortly after they got married, and they did not have a chance to have children. And so in the Jewish custom, the wife would be pledged to the next of kin. The first son that they had would be dedicated in the name of the dead person, the dead spouse, so that his name shall continue to go on. So when he died, she was pledged to be married to the second son, Onan. But Onan would sleep with her. He married her, he kept her, he would sleep with her. But when it came time to give seed for them to be able to get pregnant, he would spill his seed on the ground. If you know what that means, you know what that means. And so God saw this as being very evil. He was doing it to spite his brother, because he didn't want to give his brother a name. He didn't want to have a child for his brother. And so God ended up killing him too. So at this point, Judah is very concerned, and the third son was too young to marry. His name was Shalal. And so he told her in a deceptive type of way, go back to your father's house, and I'll let you know when he's old enough to marry. Well, she's living in her father's house as a widow for years and years. She's wearing the widow's garment and all of this. And so she comes to the realization that he lied to her. He wasn't planning on wedding her, and that in his plan, she would stay in her father's house and basically die with no children, no husband, nothing. And so she heard somebody had told her in passing that he was going to be passing through her town to go to shear his sheep. And so she changed out of her widow's garment. She put on the garb of a prostitute, and she wore a veil to conceal her face. Judah ended up seeing her. He propositioned her. They slept together, and she ended up pregnant. Well, during the time of consummation, she asked him, before she let him sleep with her, she asked him what he was going to give her to sleep with her. And he told her, he promised her all these things he would give her on his way back after he finished shearing his sheep. And she was like, well, just give me something to hold on to until you get back so I'll know. And he gave her his staff. He gave her his pendant, which was like, it had his family symbol or something on it, so everybody would know who it was. And he gave her something else. But anyway, when she came up 3 months later that she was pregnant, Judah didn't know who she was. When he came back to give her the payment, she was completely disappeared. And so he decided not to ask around because and not to ask around too much, because he didn't want to embarrass himself. So when she came up 3 months later pregnant, he had no clue that that was the same prostitute that he had slept with. He rounded up all these people to call her out to be stoned. And she sends him a message, and she's like, okay, I understand. You're right. I should be stoned because I had sex outside of the marriage that you pledged me to. He basically said she was his property, his family's property, and she shouldn't be sleeping with anybody else. And so she said, I just asked that whoever these belong to, all the pledges that he gave her, that they be called out too. And so she sent him back his staff and his pendant, and he felt ashamed suddenly because he realized what she had did, that she had to, because she realized his deception, she felt she had to trick him in order to be able to bear children for him. She just wanted to do what was her duty to her to the family that she was married into. And so I thought that it was beautiful that she was included in Jesus' lineage, because as you see, Judah already had another son, Shalal, that was from his lawful wife. And so Jesus' lineage could have came through him, but instead they chose the Gentile woman who had went through all these measures just to do the right thing for his family. Sorry guys, I have allergies. Anyway, continuing on. So she gave birth to twins, and the twins were Pharez and Zara, and Pharez was the one that continued the lineage. So Pharez fathered Hezron, and Hezron fathered Aram, and Aram fathered Aminadab, and Aminadab fathered Nahshon, and Nahshon fathered Salmon, and Salmon fathered Boaz out of Rahab. So here we come to another Gentile woman, and she was actually a prostitute who living in the walls of Jericho when they came out of the wilderness after their 40 years sentence of being roaming around the wilderness. Jericho was the first major city that they overtook in the promised land. And so when the two spies were sent to try to scope out and formulate a plan to attack, she helped them. She brought them into her home. She hid them from the soldiers that came to look for them. And in return, they created a covenant with her to save her and her entire family. And so in the story of Rahab, she ends up being inducted into the Jewish culture. At first, they had to go through a ritual cleansing to be able to be considered part of the culture. They had to be purged of all of the idols and things that they were used to from Jericho. But we see here in the lineage that she ended up marrying an Israelite man, and through him she gave birth to Boaz, and Boaz was described as a mighty man. So he was a warrior. He was very prominent in the land. He owned fields. So she ended up being very well off as a Gentile woman who came from nothing. She was a prostitute. Again, this shows God's love for the broken people, the people who live by faith, because she came from a pagan nation. They didn't believe in God, but they've heard the stories about Egypt, God in Egypt. She ended up being very well off for a young woman who came from a very pagan nation. They served many gods, and she was also a prostitute in that nation. So she was poor. She was in a shameful occupation, and she had a house full of people. It had to be at least 8 people with her, that all was crammed into one house. So she was not honorable even in her own land, and she ended up being honorable with the Israelites. She ended up gaining honor with them. So out of her, she had Boaz, and Boaz fathered Obed out of Ruth. Here we go, another Gentile woman who was led by great faith. Ruth was the daughter-in-law of a Israelite woman named Naomi, who was moved to the land of Moab during a famine. So her husband and moved her and her 2 sons to Moab to try to escape the famine in Israel. And so he was trying to escape. He goes to Moab and he ends up dying. And over the course of time, she's raising her 2 sons up, and they both get married to Moabite women. Ruth is one of those women. She was married to one of her sons for 10 years. It doesn't say how both of her sons ended up dying, but either way, Naomi was determined to get back to her homeland. She did not feel that she needed to be in Moab anymore. All of her family, she lost both her sons, her husband, so she was all by herself. And she really felt ashamed going back home, because all of the people that were given to her to care over her were gone. So she was going back to basically nothing. But she was determined to go back. And Ruth, what I'm guessing is that over time, her relationship with them is seeing their faith, seeing their experiences with God, even in a land of Moab, which was known for also serving foreign gods, for serving Baal and Moloch. They were known for killing their children as sacrifices to these gods in order to gain wealth or whatever, notoriety, whatever it was that they were trying to get. And so she saw her faith through living with her, and she held on to that faith. And so Ruth ended up coming into the land of Israel. She was scorned for a long time, trying to get accustomed to the land. So when she went to go try to pick for food in a random field, that's when she ran into Boaz. He was very wealthy. He owned a large plots of land with grain, and he would hire people to come and harvest his grain for him and all of these things. And so he noticed her, and he protected her from being beaten, from being taken advantage of, because she was a foreigner. And a lot of them at that time did not appreciate people from certain nations that they had contention with. We'll get to the book of Ruth, but she ended up being with Boaz, and she gave birth to a son that was promised to her that he would be a king. And Obed was actually the as we're about to see here, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David the king. So Ruth was actually the great grandmother of King David. God always fulfills his word, and the fact that he used so many Gentiles, and especially Gentile women. Women were not an important part of the lineage, but here we see that God honored them. He honored their faith by lifting them up with men of virtue. We honored them leaving all of the idolatry that they came from to serve him wholeheartedly. So here we go on to start with David. And it says, and David the king fathered Solomon out of her who had been the wife of Uriah. So here Matthew is being kind of, he's being kind of like tongue in cheek, like, yeah, we're not even gonna name her. We're gonna honor the man who she was married to, because he's talking about Bathsheba, who was the wife of Uriah, and David had him murdered because of him committing adultery with Bathsheba. He saw her outside. He asked them to go and get her for them and slept with her, and she ended up being pregnant. And so he went through this whole scheme to try to cover up his tracks. And so in a way, Matthew is right here. He's giving honor to the man who was her husband, who was a very honorable man, which is why David had to resort to killing him to try to cover his tracks, because nothing that David tried to do to trick the man into helping him in his schemes would work, because he was such an honorable man. He was a soldier. He was close to David. He ate at David's table. And so here Matthew is honoring him. And they are all Israelites. Bathsheba was an Israelite. David and Uriah were Israelites. So Solomon fathered Rehoboam, and Rehoboam fathered Abijah, and Abijah fathered Asa, and Asa fathered Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat fathered Jehoram, and Jehoram fathered Uzziah, and Uzziah fathered Jotham, and Jotham fathered Ahaz, and Ahaz fathered Hezekiah. We're moving through these pretty quickly because it's, I mean, all of their stories are very prolific. You can basically read about every single one of these people in 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So I'm not going to break that all down, because it's pretty a straightforward line. You could just go and read through the books and just see straight how it connects in the activities of these people. But the Gentile women, the stories were all scattered, and it might be hard to connect reading a paragraph or two in Genesis about Tamar, and then coming here and seeing her name in a lineage thousands of years later. So to continue, Jotham fathered Ahaz, and Ahaz fathered Hezekiah, and Hezekiah fathered Manasseh, and Manasseh fathered Amon, and Amon fathered Josiah, and Josiah fathered Joachim and his brothers at the carrying away of Babylon. So right here, Matthew is making a clear distinction on when they ended up getting exiled to Babylon, because it created a break in a lot of families, because everything was torn down. The temple was destroyed. Their land was destroyed. They were carried away into a foreign land. They were made to be slaves and captives. And so here we see how God preserved Jesus' lineage, even though a lot of people lost their heritage because they were in Babylon for so long. I think it was at least 70 years. And so they some of their heritages started to get destroyed until along came Nehemiah, who rebuilt the wall. And he ended up, after he rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem, he rebuilt some of the structures in the town, and he had some of the government officials and people with him. They gathered together all of the people that were still alive and try to piece together their heritage. And here we see that Jesus' lineage was preserved. So After the carrying away of Babylon, Jehoiachin fathered Shealtiel, and Shealtiel fathered Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel fathered Abud, and Abud fathered Eliakim, and Eliakim fathered Azor, and Azor fathered Sadak, and Sadak fathered Achim, and Achim fathered Elud, and Elud fathered Eleazar, and Eleazar fathered Mathan, and Mathan fathered Jacob, and Jacob fathered Joseph, the betrothed husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Christ. So here we come up to the climax of Jesus's lineage, and we find out that this entire lineage that's listed here in Matthew is actually through Joseph, who wasn't even biologically his father. Joseph wasn't even the biological father of Jesus, but God honored him in leading Matthew to detail his lineage in this way, because even though he did not have physical a physical connection to Jesus, he had legal and spiritual authority over him, because he was married to Mary. Mary was pregnant by the Holy Spirit. But because of their marriage, he had authority over Jesus as his father. He raised him. And we can see him in a little bit of the little bit that we know of Jesus' childhood. We even see him being present in with Jesus at 12 years old. So Jesus spent his whole life with him as his earthly father. And so they honored him here in the lineage. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the carrying away to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the carrying away to Babylon until Christ, 14 generations. So from what I've looked up, we can't really it doesn't seem that anybody really has a solidified answer on why Matthew decided to count out the generations in this way. What the 14 generations is supposed to signify from him. Maybe it was clearer back then when he actually wrote it, but people speculate that it's just because he had an affinity with numbers, and other people speculate that it has something to do with the number 5. Some people believe that the number 5 is a symbol of grace, and so we'll just leave that where it is. Now the birth of Jesus Christ was this way, for his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph before they had come together. She was discovered to be pregnant in womb by the Holy Spirit, but her husband Joseph, being just and not willing to make her a public example, he purposed to put her away secretly. So Joseph So just to break down the difference between betrothal and being a husband, right? So their culture was not like how our current culture is. Betrothed is not the same as being engaged. It was more than being engaged. They were actually pledged to be married. And so he already had basically all the legal documents. He had the marriage certificate. They had everything except for the ceremony and moving her into his house. That was the only difference before they came together. So they hadn't consummated the marriage, which also is it's a legal sign that this is now your spouse. If you hadn't consummated the marriage, then you're technically not yet married. He would have had to go through this whole process to divorce her. And so she was still in her father's house at this time, which is why they called them betrothed, because she was already somewhat legally his wife. Nobody else could pledge to marry her. She was already signed the paperwork, supposed to go through the ceremony with him when he found out about her pregnancy. And so even though he didn't want to deal with the embarrassment of her being pregnant, he didn't understand. He was just a man that was trying to live righteously in a time where they didn't all have access to the Holy Spirit like we do. And so he just went off the information that he could see. He didn't know what happened to her. Mary was estimated to be a young girl, 14 or 15 years old. So he didn't know if she had went out and did something willingly or unwillingly. But he decided in his heart that he didn't want to deal with the embarrassment of trying to marry a woman that was already pregnant. but he also he didn't want to be ridiculed and cast out because of it, but he also didn't want to cause shame to her. He still had compassion on her. And so as he was thinking about it, behold, an angel of the Lord was seen by him in a dream. So he went to sleep one night while he was debating going to divorce her. And an angel of the Lord was seen by him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid. So right there, the angel is confirming that Joseph was battling a lot of fear around what would be said about him and his marriage if he went through with it. Don't be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for that in her is fathered by the Holy Spirit. And she will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. The angel is confirming what was going on inside of him, even if he wasn't expressing it outwardly. I know that that had to be a strange thing to try to ponder and understand. Was this woman being pregnant by the Spirit of God? Like, how can a person of flesh be pregnant by a spirit? But because he was a righteous man, because he believed the Bible up until the books that they had at his time, because he believed the move of God, he listened to the angel and he followed through and he was obedient. So now all this happened so that it might be fulfilled that spoken by the Lord through the prophet. They're talking about prophet Isaiah, saying, behold, the virgin will conceive in her womb and will bear a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel, which translated is God with us. And being aroused from sleep, Joseph did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took his wife, and did not know her until she bore her son. So he went through with the marriage ceremony, and he honored her body. He honored her being a temple. I'm sure that he probably had some confusion about what was going on, but at the end of the day, he knew that God was doing something powerful through this, because this woman was pregnant by the Spirit of God. And so he decided to honor her body, which also is a symbol of how important our bodies are to God. How much he reverences us, having respect for that. So technically, they didn't consummate the marriage until after Jesus was born. Aroused from sleep, Joseph did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and he took his wife, and he did not know her until she bore her son, the firstborn, and he called his name Jesus. All right, so because this is getting a little long, I'm gonna go ahead and cut the video off here, and I'll come back with Matthew chapter 2, which picks up from his birth, and it goes into like his early infancy and childhood. So thank you guys for watching. I hope that you enjoyed going through this chapter with me. I really enjoyed taking the notes, learning things that I didn't know before from simply just reading through it quickly. And yeah, I'll see you guys soon.